February 19, 1945. The winter morning broke cold and gray over Camp Allegiance, a small prisoner of war facility nestled in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. Inside the women's barracks, 53 female German prisoners stirred from their bunks at the sound of the morning bell, preparing for another day of monotonous routine. But Private First Class Robert Lee, standing guard outside the mess hall, knew this day would be different from any other in the history of American prisoner of war operations. Elfriede Richter, a 24-year-old former communications specialist from Dresden, pulled on her worn gray auxiliary uniform and smoothed her dark blonde hair into the regulation bun she had maintained even in captivity. 4 months of imprisonment had taught her to expect nothing beyond basic survival: watery oatmeal for breakfast, thin soup for lunch, and bread with occasional meat for dinner. The routine had become almost comforting in its predictability, a small anchor of normalcy in a world turned upside down by capture and defeat. When the women were called to assembly in the mess hall earlier than usual, confusion rippled through their ranks. Waltraud Hoffmann, a sturdy 26-year-old from Cologne who had served as a radio operator, exchanged worried glances with Irmgard Becker, a slight 22-year-old translator from Frankfurt. In their experience, unexpected changes in routine meant trouble, interrogations, transfers, or worse. They filed into the mess hall with the mechanical obedience that had become second nature, their faces carefully neutral masks that revealed nothing of their fear. But the scene that greeted them stopped the prisoners in their tracks. The usual long metal tables had been covered with white sheets that approximated tablecloths. Steam rose from dozens of serving dishes arranged along the tables in a display that seemed almost festive. The aroma that filled the hall was unlike anything the women had encountered during their imprisonment. Sweet and tangy, with undertones of ginger and garlic, mixed with the savory scent of fried rice and something else they could not identify. Elfriede felt her empty stomach clench at the sight and smell of actual food, real food that bore no resemblance to the bland military rations they had grown accustomed to. Plates were piled high with chunks of meat glazed in a reddish-orange sauce studded with pieces of pineapple and peppers. Other dishes held mounds of rice dotted with vegetables and egg, crispy golden rolls that glistened with oil, and steaming vegetables prepared in ways the German women had never seen. Captain Helen Morrison stood at the front of the hall, her stern face softened by what might have been the hint of a smile. Beside her, Private First Class Robert Lee stood at attention, though his dark eyes moved across the faces of the shocked prisoners with an expression that Elfriede could only describe as hopeful. The Chinese-American Guard, who had been assigned to their facility 4 months earlier, had always seemed different from the other Americans, quieter, more observant, less openly hostile. But this elaborate display of food seemed impossibly generous for enemy prisoners. October 23, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the Pennsylvania countryside, carrying its cargo of defeated enemies toward an uncertain future. Elfriede Richter pressed her face against the small window, watching the autumn landscape roll past in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her painfully of the forests outside Dresden. She had been captured 3 weeks earlier in France, part of a Wehrmacht communications unit that had been overrun by advancing American forces. The speed of Germany's collapse in the West had shocked her, shattering the propaganda promises of inevitable victory that had sustained her through 2 years of auxiliary service. Beside her, Waltraud Hoffmann sat with rigid posture despite the truck's jostling movement, her square jaw set in determination to maintain dignity even in defeat. She had served as a radio operator in Belgium before her capture, listening to increasingly desperate messages as German positions crumbled. Across from them, Irmgard Becker clutched a small cloth bag containing her few remaining possessions: a photograph of her 2 younger sisters, a letter from her mother dated 6 months earlier, and a battered German-English dictionary she had used in her work as a translator. The truck finally stopped before a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by barbed wire fencing. Camp Allegiance looked nothing like the massive prisoner of war facilities the women had heard about in whispered conversations during their journey across the Atlantic. This was clearly a hastily converted training facility, small and somewhat isolated from the main military operations. As the prisoners climbed down from the truck, American soldiers watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Many had never seen female enemy combatants before and seemed uncertain how to respond to these gray-uniformed women who looked so much like their own sisters and sweethearts. Captain Helen Morrison emerged from the administrative building, her crisp uniform and no-nonsense demeanor immediately establishing her authority. She was a tall woman in her late 30s with steel gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. She had volunteered for this unusual assignment, overseeing female prisoners, believing that women should guard women even if those women wore enemy uniforms. Her first address to the new arrivals was delivered in clear, firm English that none of them fully understood, though the tone conveyed expectations of obedience and order. Elfrida tried to follow the captain's words, picking out familiar phrases from her limited English education. She caught rules, cooperation, and Geneva Convention, words that suggested they would be treated according to international law rather than shot as some had feared during the terrifying days after their capture. The other women shifted nervously, their faces showing the strain of weeks of uncertainty, fear, and the grinding realization that everything they had believed about Germany's righteousness and inevitable victory had been lies. As they were led to their assigned barracks, Elfrida noticed one guard who stood apart from the others. He was clearly of Asian descent, Chinese or Japanese, she guessed, though she knew little about such distinctions. His presence among the American soldiers surprised her. Propaganda had told them that America's racial divisions would weaken the enemy, yet here stood this man in an American uniform, watching the German prisoners with an expression that seemed more contemplative than hostile. Private First Class Robert Lee had not wanted this assignment. When his commanding officer informed him that he would be transferred to Camp Allegiance to help guard female German prisoners, his first reaction had been protest. He had enlisted to fight, to prove his loyalty to America, to show that Chinese Americans were just as patriotic as anyone else, despite the suspicion and discrimination they faced daily. Instead, he found himself assigned to babysit a handful of captured Nazi women in rural Pennsylvania, far from any real action. Robert's family had immigrated to Chicago in 1923, part of the small Chinese community that had established itself in the city's south side. His father had worked in a laundry for 15 years before saving enough to open a small restaurant with Robert's uncle. The Golden Phoenix served authentic Cantonese dishes to a mostly Chinese clientele, with a few adventurous white customers who were curious about exotic Oriental food. Robert had grown up translating for his parents, navigating between their traditional Chinese world and the American society that viewed them with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Robert had immediately tried to enlist, despite his mother's tears and his father's warnings. He wanted to fight the Japanese, to make it clear that Chinese Americans were on America's side, that they were not the enemy despite their Asian faces. The recruitment officer had looked at him with barely concealed skepticism before finally accepting his paperwork. Throughout basic training, Robert had endured comments from fellow soldiers who could not or would not distinguish between Chinese and Japanese, who made jokes about spies and fifth columnists even as he outperformed most of them in marksmanship and tactical exercises. His first sight of the German prisoners surprised him. He had expected hard-faced Nazi fanatics, women who embodied the Aryan ideology of racial superiority. Instead, he saw frightened young women who looked exhausted and defeated, their eyes reflecting the same uncertainty he had seen in his own mother's face when customers at the restaurant made cruel comments about Orientals. These women were the enemy, certainly, had served the regime that had allied with Japan and helped create the war that had killed thousands of American soldiers. Yet standing in the cold October afternoon, watching them stumble off the transport truck, Robert found it difficult to see them as monsters. Captain Morrison approached him after the initial processing. "Private Lee, I understand you speak some German?" Robert shook his head. "No, ma'am. My family speaks Cantonese and English. I never studied German." The captain frowned slightly. "The file said you had language skills. We need guards who can communicate with the prisoners." Robert almost smiled at the irony. "I can learn, ma'am. I picked up enough Italian from neighbors in Chicago. Languages aren't too difficult for me." What he did not say was that growing up translating for his parents had taught him to read not just words but gestures, expressions, and the universal language of human emotion that transcended any specific tongue. The first weeks at Camp Allegiance established a routine built on silence and distance. 3 times daily, the German prisoners filed into the mess hall for meals that were adequate by military standards but bland and monotonous. Breakfast brought watery oatmeal or occasionally scrambled powdered eggs. Lunch consisted of thin vegetable soup with chunks of bread. Dinner offered slightly more variety: boiled potatoes, canned vegetables, and occasional servings of mystery meat that the women learned not to examine too closely. Everything tasted of tin and desperation, seasoned only with salt and the bitter knowledge of defeat. Elfrida found the mealtimes almost unbearably tense. The prisoners sat at long metal tables, eating in near silence, while American guards stood watch along the walls. Any conversation occurred in whispered German, heads bent close together, eyes darting nervously toward their captors. The women had developed an unspoken agreement to maintain dignity through military bearing: straight backs, controlled movements, faces carefully composed into masks of neutral resignation. They would not give their enemies the satisfaction of seeing them broken, even if they felt shattered inside. Captain Morrison observed these meals with clinical interest, taking notes on a small pad she always carried. She noticed how the prisoners organized themselves by age and former rank, how certain women naturally assumed leadership roles even in captivity. She saw the way they rationed their meager portions, sometimes sliding extra bread to the youngest or thinnest among them. Despite their enemy status, Morrison could not help but respect their discipline and the quiet solidarity they maintained. These were not cowards or criminals. They were soldiers who had lost nothing more and nothing less. Robert Lee drew guard duty during mealtimes, more frequently than seemed coincidental. He suspected Captain Morrison was testing him, watching to see if his Asian features would provoke hostile reactions from the German prisoners who had allied with Japan. But the women barely looked at him, their gazes sliding past as if he were invisible. He found this oddly more offensive than open hostility would have been. At least hatred acknowledged someone's existence. This willful blindness suggested he did not even register as fully human to them. Yet Robert continued to watch the prisoners with growing curiosity. He noticed small details that other guards missed: the way the dark-haired woman from Dresden always arranged her utensils precisely parallel before eating, how the sturdy blonde from Cologne would sometimes close her eyes when tasting the bread, as if trying to remember something from before the war. The thin translator from Frankfurt had a nervous habit of touching the collar of her uniform, fingers tracing where an insignia had been removed. These were not grand gestures of humanity, just tiny habits that revealed the individual people beneath the enemy uniforms. One evening in early November, as autumn rain drummed against the mess hall windows, Robert noticed that several of the younger prisoners were shivering despite their jackets. The heating system in the old building was inadequate at best. He mentioned this to Sergeant Williams, who shrugged indifferently. "They're Nazis, Lee. Let them freeze." But Robert could not shake the image of those women trying to eat, while their hands trembled from cold, pride preventing them from complaining about conditions that clearly violated basic standards of humane treatment. November 15th brought the first significant frost to the Pennsylvania hills. The prisoners were assigned to outdoor work details despite the cold, raking leaves, clearing drainage ditches, performing the endless maintenance tasks required to keep the camp functional. Waltraud Hoffman worked alongside Irmgard Becker, their breath-forming white clouds in the frigid air, as they cleared fallen branches from the area behind the barracks. Neither woman complained, though their fingers had gone numb inside their thin work gloves hours earlier. Complaining would show weakness, and weakness was something they could not afford to display. Elfrida had been assigned to a different detail, sorting supplies in one of the storage buildings. The work was tedious, but at least offered shelter from the biting wind. She was carrying a heavy box of canned goods when her foot caught on an uneven floorboard. The box crashed to the concrete floor, cans rolling in every direction as Elfrida fell hard on her hands and knees. Pain shot through her right wrist, and she bit her lip to prevent crying out. She would not give them that satisfaction. She would not be weak. But the dizziness that suddenly washed over her had nothing to do with the fall. Elfrida had been fighting a persistent fever for 3 days, refusing to report to the medical station because she feared being isolated or receiving inadequate care. Now, kneeling among scattered cans in a cold storage room, she felt the world tilt sideways. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, and the last thing she registered before losing consciousness was the sound of boots running toward her across the concrete floor. Robert Lee had been conducting a routine patrol of the storage facilities when he heard the crash. He found the German prisoner collapsed on the floor, her face flushed with fever despite the cold temperature of the building. He dropped to one knee beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck to check her pulse. It was racing, her skin burning hot to the touch. He called out for assistance, then carefully lifted the unconscious woman in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, he realized with concern. Had the prisoners been receiving adequate rations? Elfrida regained consciousness as Robert carried her across the compound toward the medical station. For a moment, confusion overwhelmed her. Where was she? Why was someone carrying her? Who was this person with the dark hair and kind eyes? Then, memory returned in a rush of shame. She had fainted like a weak child, had failed to maintain the dignity expected of a German soldier, even in defeat. She tried to protest, to insist she could walk, but the words came out in German, and her body refused to cooperate with her mind's commands. "Easy," Robert said softly in English, the tone conveying meaning even if the word did not. "You're sick. Need doctor." His accent was pure American Midwest, which somehow surprised Elfrida even in her fevered state. She had expected something foreign, something other. Instead, he sounded like the American soldiers in the propaganda films, except his voice carried genuine concern rather than the theatrical heroism of cinema. She stopped struggling, too exhausted to fight both her illness and her rescue, and allowed herself to be carried the rest of the way. The camp medical officer, Dr. Samuel Harris, diagnosed Elfrida with bronchitis and mild pneumonia, conditions he attributed to poor nutrition and inadequate heating in the barracks. He prescribed bed rest, antibiotics from the limited supply available, and better food if such a thing could be arranged. Captain Morrison, confronted with evidence that her prisoners were being housed in substandard conditions, immediately ordered improvements to the heating system and authorized supplementary rations for all the women. She would run her camp by the book, and the book required humane treatment regardless of enemy status. Elfrida spent 5 days in the medical station, a small building with 8 beds that currently housed only 2 other patients, an American private recovering from appendicitis and a German prisoner who had suffered a broken arm during work detail. The enforced rest gave her time to think, to remember, to confront the reality of her situation without the distractions of routine. She thought about her family in Dresden, wondering if they had received any of her letters, if they even knew she was alive. She thought about the war that had seemed so glorious when she had volunteered for auxiliary service, and how that glory had revealed itself as ash and death. Robert Lee drew guard duty at the medical station on his third day of recovery. He brought with him a book and a thermos of tea, expecting to spend a quiet shift reading while the patient slept. But Elfrida was awake, staring at the ceiling with eyes that suggested she was seeing something far beyond the wooden beams above her bed. Robert settled into his chair near the door, trying to focus on his book, but he found his attention drawn repeatedly to the German woman who looked so lost in her own thoughts. Finally, surprising himself, Robert spoke. "You feel better?" His English was clear, but he kept his voice soft, aware that direct conversation with prisoners was technically discouraged. Elfrida turned her head toward him, startled. She had not expected the Chinese-American guard to speak to her. For a long moment she said nothing, then replied in careful, heavily accented English. "Yes, thank you. You carry me." It was a statement rather than a question, confirming what she vaguely remembered from her collapse. Robert nodded. "You very sick." "Pneumonia." He paused, then added, "My sister, she had pneumonia 2 years ago, in Chicago. Very scared for her." He was not sure why he was sharing this personal information with an enemy prisoner. Perhaps it was the isolation of the night shift, the strange intimacy of a sick room, or simply the recognition that sometimes human connection mattered more than political enmity. Elfrida absorbed this information, processing the unexpected revelation that this guard had a sister, a family, a life beyond his role as her captor. "She is well now?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes," Robert smiled slightly. "She is very healthy, very loud. Drives my mother crazy." The small joke, the glimpse of normal family dynamics, created a crack in the wall between them. December brought heavy snows to the Pennsylvania hills and a crushing weight of homesickness to Camp Allegiance. The German prisoners watched through frosted windows as American soldiers decorated a small pine tree outside the administrative building, hanging handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. The sight triggered memories of Christmases past, warm homes, family gatherings, the scent of Lebkuchen and stolen baking in mothers' kitchens. Those memories felt like they belonged to different people, women who had existed in a different world that no longer existed anywhere except in increasingly painful recollections. Elfrida had recovered from her pneumonia, but found herself struggling with a different kind of sickness. She had received no letters from her family since her capture in October. The Red Cross had promised to help locate her parents and younger brother, but the chaos in Germany made such searches nearly impossible. Every day without news felt like another small death, another piece of hope extinguished. She tried to maintain the stoic dignity expected of a German soldier, but at night in her bunk, she sometimes pressed her face into her thin pillow to muffle the sounds of crying. Waltraud Hoffmann dealt with her own grief through rigid adherence to routine. She woke precisely at dawn, made her bed with military precision, ate her meals without tasting them, and completed every assigned task with mechanical efficiency. If she kept moving, kept working, kept her mind occupied with the immediate demands of survival, then perhaps she could avoid thinking about her parents in Cologne, about whether Allied bombs had destroyed their small apartment, about the very real possibility that she was now orphaned and alone in the world. Irmgard Becker had always been the most fragile of the three women, though she tried to hide her vulnerability behind practiced smiles. At 22, she was one of the youngest prisoners in the camp. Her two sisters were both still teenagers, living with their mother in Frankfurt while their father served somewhere on the Eastern Front. Irmgard had joined the Auxiliary Corps partly to ease the financial burden on her family, sending most of her salary home each month. Now she sent letters into a void, not knowing if anyone received them or if there was still a home to receive anything. Captain Morrison noticed the deepening depression among her prisoners as Christmas approached. She had seen similar patterns in previous years, working with displaced persons and refugees. The holidays amplified every loss, every absence, every broken connection to the lives they had known before. She consulted with Dr. Harris about the mental health implications of prolonged isolation and uncertainty. Both agreed that something needed to be done to lift the spirits of these women, not out of sentiment but out of practical concern for maintaining order and preventing self-harm. The captain called a meeting with her senior staff to discuss options. Most of the American soldiers were indifferent to the prisoners' emotional state, viewing any kindness as wasted on the enemy. But Robert Lee spoke up during the discussion, suggesting that simple acknowledgement of the holiday might help. His grandmother in Chicago had taught him that food was the universal language of comfort, that sharing a meal could bridge any divide. Captain Morrison listened thoughtfully, an idea beginning to form. January brought bitter cold and the slow, grinding realization among the German prisoners that the war was nearing its inevitable end. News filtered into the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts. The Red Army advancing from the east, Allied forces preparing to cross the Rhine, German cities falling one after another to relentless bombardment. Each piece of news was simultaneously hoped for and dreaded. The sooner the war ended, the sooner they might learn the fate of their families. But the end of the war also meant Germany's complete defeat, the destruction of everything they had believed their service was defending. Robert Lee had been thinking about his conversation with Captain Morrison since December. The idea of using food as a bridge between cultures, between enemies, had taken root in his mind and grown into something approaching obsession. Chinese New Year would fall on February 17th this year, and his grandmother had already sent her annual care package from Chicago. Dried mushrooms, special sauces, rice paper for spring rolls, and her handwritten recipes that Robert had been collecting since childhood. On January 23rd, Robert requested a formal meeting with Captain Morrison. She received him in her office, curious about what the quiet Chinese-American guard wanted to discuss. Robert stood at attention, having rehearsed his proposal dozens of times. "Ma'am, I would like permission to prepare a Chinese New Year feast for the camp, including the prisoners." The captain's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Explain your reasoning, Private." Robert took a breath and began describing his family's restaurant, how food had always been his grandmother's way of showing love and building community, how she had fed not just Chinese immigrants, but anyone who came hungry to her door. He explained that Chinese New Year was about renewal, about sweeping away old misfortunes and welcoming new possibilities. The holiday celebrated family, community, and the hope that the coming year would bring better fortune than the last. "These women are far from their families, ma'am. They don't know if their families still exist. Chinese New Year isn't their tradition, but the feelings behind it, the longing for home, for connection, for hope, those are universal." Robert's voice grew more confident as he continued. "My grandmother always said that when you share food with someone, you're sharing a piece of yourself, a piece of your culture. You're saying, 'I see you as human, worthy of the effort it takes to prepare this meal.'" Captain Morrison listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. When Robert finished, she asked several practical questions about ingredients, preparation time, and kitchen access. Then she asked the most important question. "Private Lee, why do you care about the emotional well-being of enemy prisoners?" Robert met her eyes directly. "Because I know what it's like to be seen as the enemy because of how I look, ma'am. Every day since Pearl Harbor, people look at me and see Japan, see the enemy, even though my family is Chinese and we're American citizens. These women served Germany, yes, but they're not monsters. They're just people who made choices based on limited information and propaganda. If we treat them like humans, maybe they'll learn what real humanity looks like." The captain was silent for a long moment, weighing the unprecedented nature of the request against the potential benefits. Captain Morrison approved Robert's proposal with strict conditions. He would have 3 days to prepare the feast using only ingredients he could source himself or that his family sent from Chicago. The meal would be served during the regular dinner hour on February 19th, 2 days after the actual Chinese New Year, to allow time for proper preparation. All standard security protocols would remain in effect, and the prisoners would be informed only on the day of the feast to prevent unrealistic expectations or potential disappointment if complications arose. Robert immediately wrote to his grandmother explaining the situation and asking for additional supplies. Her response arrived within a week, a large package containing everything he needed, along with a letter written in Chinese characters that Robert translated with some difficulty. His grandmother wrote that she was proud of him for remembering the most important lesson she had taught him, that kindness was never wasted, even when given to those who might not deserve it. She included her special recipe for sweet and sour pork, the dish that had made the Golden Phoenix famous in Chicago's Chinatown. The camp kitchen became Robert's domain during his off-duty hours. He spent evenings after his guard shifts preparing components that could be made in advance, chopping vegetables with the precision his grandmother had taught him, mixing sauces in carefully measured proportions, soaking rice in preparation for frying. The camp cooks watched with bemused curiosity as this Chinese-American private transformed military rations and care package ingredients into something that actually smelled appetizing. Sergeant Williams, the senior kitchen supervisor, sampled a spring roll during one preparation session and grudgingly admitted it was the best thing to come out of that kitchen in months. Word of the upcoming special meal spread among the American staff, but was deliberately kept from the German prisoners. Captain Morrison wanted to gauge their genuine reactions without giving them time to construct defensive emotional walls. However, the increased kitchen activity and the tantalizing aromas that occasionally drifted from the mess hall created speculation among the women. Elfrida noticed that Private Lee seemed energized, moving with purposeful focus during his guard duties. Something was happening, though she could not determine what. Waltraud remarked to Irmgard during their work detail that the Americans seemed different somehow, less rigidly hostile and more anticipatory. Irmgard, ever the analyst, suggested that perhaps some inspection was coming or a visiting dignitary expected. Neither woman imagined the truth, that their Chinese-American guard was spending his free time preparing an elaborate feast specifically for them. The idea would have seemed absurd, impossible, too generous to be real. Enemy prisoners did not receive feasts. They received adequate rations and nothing more. On the morning of February 19th, Robert arrived at the kitchen before dawn to begin the final preparations. He had barely slept, too anxious about whether the food would turn out properly, whether his grandmother's recipes would translate successfully in this inadequate military kitchen. The morning of February 19th passed with agonizing slowness for Robert Lee. He worked in the kitchen with singular focus, his hands moving through familiar motions that connected him across miles to his grandmother's restaurant in Chicago. The sweet and sour sauce simmered in large pots, filling the kitchen with an aroma that made even the skeptical American cooks pause in appreciation. Robert had adapted his grandmother's recipe to feed 60 people, carefully scaling up proportions while maintaining the delicate balance of flavors that made the dish special. By noon, the preparation was well underway. Spring rolls rested on cooling racks, their golden surfaces glistening with oil. Vegetables had been cut into uniform pieces, ready for the final stir-fry that would happen just before serving. The pork had been carefully cubed and prepared, waiting to be coated in cornstarch and fried to crispy perfection, before being tossed in the sweet and sour sauce. Rice steamed in massive quantities, each grain separate and perfect as his grandmother had taught him. At 1400 hours, Captain Morrison gave the order for the German prisoners to assemble in the mess hall for an announcement. The women filed in with their usual mixture of obedience and wariness, expecting another routine briefing, or perhaps news about repatriation procedures. Instead, they found the hall transformed. The harsh overhead lights had been dimmed slightly, and the metal tables were covered with white sheets that approximated tablecloths. But it was the serving dishes that captured their attention. Platters and bowls arranged with care, steam rising in fragrant clouds that smelled like nothing they had experienced before. Elfrida stopped so abruptly that Waltraud nearly collided with her from behind. Her eyes widened as she took in the impossible scene before her. The aroma alone made her mouth water, sweet and tangy with undertones of ginger and spices she could not identify. The visual presentation seemed almost decadent compared to the institutional gray of their usual meals. Chunks of meat glistened in a vibrant orange-red sauce studded with pieces of bright yellow pineapple and green peppers. Mountains of rice mixed with vegetables and scrambled egg created landscapes of color on white serving platters. Irmgard pressed a hand to her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes before she had tasted a single bite. The generosity implicit in this display overwhelmed her defenses. Someone had spent time, effort, and care creating this meal. Someone had thought they were worth this kind of attention. The realization struck her like a physical blow, shattering the emotional armor she had maintained for months. Captain Morrison stood at the front of the hall with Private Lee beside her. She spoke clearly in English, while Elfrida translated automatically in whispered German for those around her. "Ladies, Private Lee has prepared a traditional Chinese New Year feast to share with all of us. Chinese New Year celebrates renewal and hope for better fortune in the coming year. We thought you might appreciate experiencing this tradition." She paused, then added more softly, "Please, sit and eat." The prisoners moved slowly to their seats, uncertain whether this was reality or some cruel dream. Robert and several other American soldiers began serving the food, placing generous portions on each woman's plate. The first taste of sweet and sour pork broke through decades of cultural conditioning and months of emotional numbness. Elfrida placed a small piece in her mouth and felt the explosion of flavors. Sweet pineapple and tangy vinegar balanced perfectly with savory pork, all bound together with hints of ginger and garlic that created something entirely new to her palate. She had eaten pork countless times in Germany, but never prepared like this, never with such complexity and care evident in every bite. Around the hall, similar reactions rippled through the assembled prisoners. Waltraud, who had maintained stoic dignity through interrogations and imprisonment, felt tears streaming down her face as she chewed slowly, savoring taste that awakened senses she had forgotten existed. The food was abundant in a way that felt almost sinful after months of carefully rationed portions. The sauce coated her tongue with layers of flavor that demanded attention, that insisted on being experienced rather than merely consumed for sustenance. Irmgard took a bite of fried rice and made a small sound of surprise. The rice was flavored with soy sauce and sesame oil mixed with tiny pieces of vegetables and scrambled egg that created textural variety in every spoonful. She had grown up eating plain boiled potatoes and simple bread. This rice was a revelation, proof that even the most basic staple could be transformed into something special with knowledge and effort. She reached for a spring roll, biting through the crispy exterior to find vegetables and meat inside, and felt something close to joy for the first time since her capture. Robert moved through the hall with a large teapot, pouring hot jasmine tea into cups. He paused at Elfrida's table, meeting her eyes as he poured. "You like?" he asked in his careful English. Elfrida nodded, unable to trust her voice. She gestured to the food with her fork and managed to say, "Is beautiful, thank you." The inadequacy of her English frustrated her. She wanted to express what this meant, how this simple meal had reminded her that beauty and generosity still existed in a world that had seemed devoid of both. Other prisoners began asking questions in broken English or through Elfrida's translation. What were these dishes called? How were they prepared? What did Chinese New Year celebrate? Robert answered patiently, explaining that sweet and sour pork was one of his grandmother's specialties, that fried rice used day-old rice for the best texture, that spring rolls were traditionally served during celebrations. He described how Chinese New Year involved cleaning houses to sweep away bad luck, settling debts, and gathering with family to welcome new possibilities. Captain Morrison watched from her position near the door, struck by the transformation occurring in her mess hall. The German prisoners were smiling, laughing even, as they experienced flavors that transcended language barriers. The American soldiers serving the food had softened their usual stern expressions, caught up in the unexpected pleasure of watching people genuinely enjoy something they had helped create. For this one evening, the rigid divisions between captor and captive had blurred into something approaching shared humanity. As the meal progressed, several of the younger German prisoners began speaking excitedly among themselves in rapid German. Elfriede overheard fragments of their conversation and felt both amusement and sadness at their innocent misunderstanding. These women, many of whom had received minimal education about cultures beyond Europe, believed they were actually celebrating Chinese New Year itself. They thought this feast was happening on the holiday, that they were participating in the actual celebration, rather than a belated sharing of tradition. Waltraud leaned toward Elfriede and whispered, "Is this really how Chinese people celebrate their New Year? With such abundant food and generosity toward strangers?" Elfriede realized that her friend also misunderstood the situation. She glanced toward Robert, who was explaining something to another table of prisoners, and made a decision. Her English had improved significantly over the months, enough for basic communication. She raised her hand slightly, catching the attention of Private Lee. Robert approached their table, and Elfriede asked carefully, "Private Lee, Chinese New Year is today?" Robert paused, then shook his head with a slight smile. "No, Chinese New Year was February 17th, 2 days ago. This is my grandmother's recipes, but I make for you now because Captain Morrison give permission." He struggled slightly with the English grammar, focused on being understood rather than perfect. "I want to share because food is how my family shows, respect, care for people." The clarification spread through the hall as Elfriede translated for those around her. The misunderstanding's correction somehow made the gesture even more profound. Robert had not simply prepared a meal on a holiday that happened to coincide with convenient timing. He had specifically chosen to share his family's cultural traditions with enemy prisoners because he believed they deserved that kindness. He had spent days preparing food that represented his heritage and his grandmother's love, then offered it freely to women who wore the uniform of Germany's defeated forces. Irmgard felt fresh tears threatening as she absorbed this information. "Why?" she asked Robert directly in halting English. "Why you do this for us? We are enemy." Robert considered the question seriously before responding. "My family is Chinese. After Pearl Harbor, many Americans think all Asians are enemy. They see my face, they see Japan, even though we are Chinese and American. I know what it feels like when people see you as enemy because of things you cannot control." He gestured around the hall, encompassing all the prisoners. "You serve Germany, yes, but you are also people. You have families, you are far from home, you are afraid. These things I understand. My grandmother always says that when you are hungry and someone feeds you, nationality does not matter. Only the food and the kindness matter." His words, imperfect in grammar but clear in meaning, carried across the hall in Elfriede's translation. The days following the Chinese New Year feast brought a transformation to Camp Allegiance that surprised even Captain Morrison. The rigid formality that had characterized interactions between guards and prisoners began to soften, replaced by something approaching cautious friendship. The German women no longer averted their eyes when American soldiers passed. Small conversations emerged during work details. Broken English met with patient corrections, German phrases exchanged for their English equivalents, and the universal language of shared smiles that needed no translation. Elfriede found herself drawn to the camp kitchen during her free hours, hoping to learn more about the cooking that had created such memorable flavors. Robert, working his regular guard shifts, noticed her interest and obtained permission from Captain Morrison to teach basic cooking techniques to any prisoners who wanted to learn. What began as Elfriede's solitary curiosity quickly expanded to include 6 other women who gathered in the kitchen during evening hours, watching as Robert demonstrated how to properly dice vegetables or explained the importance of balancing sweet, sour, salty, and savory flavors. These informal cooking lessons became language lessons as well. Robert would name each ingredient in English: ginger, garlic, soy sauce, sesame oil, and the women would repeat the words, practicing pronunciation while learning culinary skills. Elfrida discovered she had a natural aptitude for both languages and cooking, her careful attention to detail serving her well in both pursuits. She began keeping a small notebook where she recorded recipes alongside English vocabulary, creating a hybrid document that merged practical knowledge with linguistic education. Waltraud, who had initially been skeptical of fraternizing with their captors, found herself volunteering for kitchen work duty. The structured environment reminded her of her mother's orderly household in Cologne, and the productive labor gave her something to focus on beyond her worry about her family's fate. She learned that Sergeant Williams, the senior kitchen supervisor, had worked as a baker in civilian life. Their shared understanding of measurements and timing created common ground that transcended their political differences. Irmgard discovered an unexpected connection with one of the younger American guards, Private Thomas Brennan from Boston. His grandmother had immigrated from Ireland, and he understood the experience of being caught between two cultures, two languages, two ways of seeing the world. When Irmgard struggled to express complex ideas in her limited English, Thomas would patiently wait for her to find the words rather than rushing to fill the silence. Their conversations ranged from simple topics like weather and food to more profound discussions about identity, belonging, and what it meant to call a place home. The other prisoners noticed these developing connections and began their own tentative outreach. Maria Gotch, a former clerk from Munich, started helping with administrative paperwork when she realized her meticulous handwriting and organizational skills were valued. Greta Hoffmann, who had maintained military vehicles in Germany, offered to assist with mechanical repairs around the camp. Each active contribution felt like a small reclaiming of purpose, a way to be useful rather than simply confined. Captain Morrison documented these changes in her weekly reports to command, noting improved morale among both prisoners and guards, increased cooperation during work details, and a marked decrease in disciplinary incidents. March brought the first true warmth of approaching spring and a delivery of mail that had been delayed for months in the chaos of European routing systems. The Red Cross distributed letters to those prisoners who had received correspondence, calling names in alphabetical order while the assembled women held their collective breath. Elfrida heard her name and approached the distribution table with hands that trembled slightly. The envelope was thin, addressed in handwriting she did not recognize, bearing a Dresden postmark from December. She returned to her bunk before opening it, needing privacy for whatever news this letter contained. The return address was from her mother's sister, her Aunt Helga, who lived in the suburbs outside the city center. Elfrida's hands shook as she unfolded the single page and began reading the cramped script. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. February 13th, the firebombing of Dresden. Her parents had been visiting friends in the Altstadt that night. Her younger brother Klaus had been with them. The apartment building where they lived had been completely destroyed. There were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit. They had simply ceased to exist in a storm of fire that had consumed the city. Aunt Helga's letter was brief and factual, as if emotion would make the information more unbearable than it already was. She had written to inform Elfrida that she was now alone in the world. The aunt had her own family to care for and could not take responsibility for a niece imprisoned in America. She hoped Elfrida would understand. She wished her luck. The letter ended with a prayer that God would forgive them all for what Germany had become. Elfrida sat on her bunk, the letter clutched in her hands, and felt her entire world collapse inward. February 13th. The firebombing had occurred 6 days before Robert's Chinese New Year feast. While she had been tasting sweet and sour pork and feeling the first stirrings of hope, her family had been burning to death in the city she loved. The juxtaposition seemed obscene, impossible to reconcile. How could she have been experiencing joy while they were experiencing such horror? She was still sitting motionless an hour later when Waltraud returned from work detail and found her. One look at Elfrida's face told Waltraud everything she needed to know. She sat beside her friend without speaking, placing a solid arm around trembling shoulders. Irmgard arrived moments later, and the three women who had arrived at Camp Allegiance together in October now sat together in March, united by losses too profound for words. Robert discovered them there when he came to conduct evening head count. He saw immediately that something terrible had happened. Elfrida's face was blank, shock having moved beyond tears into a deeper numbness. He caught Waltraud's eye and she shook her head slightly. Not now. Give her time. Robert nodded understanding and completed his count quickly, then left to find Captain Morrison. That evening, Captain Morrison made an exception to usual protocols and allowed the three women to remain in the barracks during dinner hour. She instructed Robert to bring them food from the kitchen, though she suspected none of them would eat. The news of Dresden's destruction was only the beginning. Throughout March and early April of 1945, as Allied forces advanced deeper into German territory, reports began filtering back to Camp Allegiance about discoveries that challenged everything the German prisoners thought they understood about their homeland. At first, the women dismissed these reports as propaganda, enemy lies designed to demoralize them, but the evidence kept mounting, corroborated by multiple sources, documented in photographs that were impossible to deny. Captain Morrison made the difficult decision to share these reports with her prisoners rather than shielding them from the truth. She believed they had a right to know what had been done in their nation's name, even if that knowledge would devastate them. She assembled the women in the recreation hall and, with Elfrida translating in a hollow voice, described what American and British forces were finding: concentration camps, gas chambers, mass graves, systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension, names that meant nothing yet: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, but would haunt history forever. The German women sat in stunned silence as Captain Morrison continued. These were not military targets. These were not casualties of war. These were deliberate, organized atrocities committed against civilians whose only crime was being Jewish or Roma or homosexual or mentally ill or politically opposed to the regime. The captain's voice remained steady as she described the conditions liberating forces had found: skeletal prisoners barely alive, evidence of medical experiments, facilities specifically designed for industrial-scale killing. Waltraud stood abruptly and ran from the room, making it only as far as the hallway before vomiting. Several other women followed, their faces reflecting horror and disbelief. Irmgard sat frozen, her mind unable to process what she was hearing. She had joined the Auxiliary Corps believing she was defending her homeland from aggressive enemies. She had typed reports and translated documents and performed administrative duties that she thought supported a defensive war. What role had her work played in enabling these atrocities? What had she been part of without knowing? Elfrida felt a different kind of devastation wash over her. Her family was dead, killed by Allied bombs that had been justified as necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. But if Germany had done these things, if her country had built factories of death and operated them with bureaucratic efficiency, then perhaps those bombs had been necessary. Perhaps her parents and brother had died as consequences of atrocities they had not committed, but had allowed through their silence and compliance. The complexity of guilt and innocence became impossible to untangle. In the days that followed, the camp library became a place of quiet reckoning. The German women pored over newspapers and magazines, reading detailed accounts from journalists who had witnessed the liberation of concentration camps. They studied photographs that showed conditions beyond their worst imaginings. Some of the women insisted the reports were exaggerated, that surely things could not have been as bad as described. But most recognized truth when they saw it, no matter how much they wished they could deny it. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with church bells ringing across America and jubilant crowds filling city streets. At Camp Allegiance, the celebration was more subdued, complicated by the presence of defeated enemies who were also displaced persons with uncertain futures. Captain Morrison received official orders regarding repatriation procedures for the female German prisoners. Transportation would be arranged within 3 weeks. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. That evening, Elfrida sat in the barracks she had occupied for 7 months, staring at the repatriation notice posted on the bulletin board. Return to Germany. Return to what? Dresden was destroyed. Her family was dead. The country she had believed she was serving had been revealed as something monstrous. What waited for her in that devastated landscape, except judgment from those who had remained and suspicion from occupying forces who would see only her auxiliary service record? She thought about the past months at Camp Allegiance. She thought about Robert teaching her to cook Chinese food and patiently correcting her English pronunciation. She thought about Captain Morrison's stern fairness and Dr. Harris's medical care that had saved her life. She thought about Private Brennan's kindness to Irmgard and Sergeant Williams, teaching Waltraud American baking techniques. These people had treated her with more humanity during her imprisonment than she had experienced in 2 years of auxiliary service. Waltraud joined her at the window, both women looking out at the spring evening. "What will you do?" Waltraud asked in German. "Will you return?" Elfrida turned the question back. "Will you?" Waltraud was silent for a long moment before answering. "My parents might be alive. I have to know. I have to try to find them. But after that, if they are gone, I do not know if I can stay in Germany. Not after learning what we learned." Irmgard approached them with several other women following. Maria Gotch, Greta Hoffmann, and 5 others who had become a close group over the months. "We have been talking," Irmgard said quietly. "Some of us are thinking about asking if we can stay here instead of returning immediately. Is that crazy? Are we being cowards?" Elfrida shook her head slowly. "I do not think it is cowardly to choose life over death. That is what returning feels like to me, returning to death." Over the next 3 days, the group met secretly, discussing possibilities and consequences. They knew their request would be unprecedented. They knew they might be refused and forced to board repatriation ships regardless of their wishes, but they also knew they had to try. Elfrida, whose English was now the most fluent among them, volunteered to speak for the group. 9 women in total had decided to make this impossible request. On May 12th, Elfrida requested a formal meeting with Captain Morrison. The captain received her in the office where they had first met 7 months earlier. Elfrida stood at attention, gathering courage for what she needed to say. "Captain Morrison, I am speaking for 9 prisoners who wish to request permission to remain in the United States rather than accept immediate repatriation to Germany." She continued in carefully prepared English, explaining their reasons: families dead or missing, homes destroyed, and most importantly, the discovery that they could not reconcile returning to a country whose actions they now understood and could not forgive. Captain Morrison's initial response was exactly what Elfrida expected: confusion, skepticism, and concern about the legal complications of prisoners requesting to remain in custody. However, the captain promised to forward the request to her superiors, while the women waited in an agonizing state of uncertainty. The other prisoners, those who had chosen repatriation, regarded the 9 with mixed emotions. Some viewed them as traitors, abandoning their homeland in its darkest hour. Others expressed quiet understanding, acknowledging that everyone had to make impossible choices with no clearly right answers. The response from Washington arrived 2 weeks later, surprisingly flexible given the unprecedented nature of the request. The War Department would not prevent voluntary repatriation for those who wished to return immediately. However, the 9 women who requested to stay could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. They would need to find American sponsors willing to vouch for them, secure employment, and demonstrate their commitment to becoming productive members of American society. Most crucially, they would no longer be housed at Camp Allegiance once their prisoner status ended. The announcement created a flurry of activity as the repatriation date approached. Robert's family in Chicago immediately offered to sponsor Elfriede. His grandmother had been deeply moved by his letters describing the cooking lessons and the young German woman who had lost everything in Dresden. The Golden Phoenix needed additional help, and teaching Elfriede the restaurant business would give her both employment and purpose. Robert's parents agreed, though his mother expressed concern about how their Chinese-American community would react to harboring a former German soldier. Dr. Harris arranged for Irmgard to continue medical training at a hospital in Philadelphia. During her time at Camp Allegiance, she had proven herself invaluable in the medical station, showing natural aptitude and genuine compassion for patients. The head nurse at Philadelphia General Hospital, a woman who believed in second chances, agreed to sponsor Irmgard's immigration application and supervise her transition from assistant to certified nurse. Waltraud faced a more difficult decision. Her inquiries through the Red Cross had finally produced results. Her parents were alive, living in the British occupation zone of Germany. They were elderly and struggling with illness and shortage. Waltraud felt torn between the new life she could build in America and her duty to parents who needed her. After long contemplation and tearful conversations with Elfriede, she chose to return, promising to maintain correspondence and possibly return to America once her parents no longer needed her care. The other women who chose to stay found sponsors through various channels. The Henderson family, who had been visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, sponsored Maria Gotch. A mechanic in Pittsburgh who had been impressed by Greta Hoffman's repair work offered her employment and sponsorship. Local families, moved by media coverage of the unprecedented situation, stepped forward to help women they had initially feared as enemy aliens. 25 years later, on a cold February evening in 1970, Elfriede Lee stood in the kitchen of the Golden Phoenix restaurant in Chicago's Chinatown. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared sweet and sour pork for a documentary film crew recording stories of immigration and reconciliation. She had mastered her grandmother-in-law's recipe years ago, making it her own specialty while honoring its origins. The restaurant had flourished under the partnership between Robert's family and Elfriede's management skills, becoming known not just for authentic Cantonese cuisine, but for its unique East meets West menu innovations. The documentary director asked Elfriede to describe the moment that changed her life. She paused in her cooking, her hands stilling over the cutting board as memories flooded back. February 19th, 1945, she began in English that now carried only the slightest trace of German accent. I was a prisoner of war, far from home, believing I had lost everything. Then, a Chinese-American guard, who had every reason to hate anyone who looked like the enemy, decided to share his grandmother's recipes with us. He made sweet and sour pork, fried rice, spring rolls, a feast we did not deserve. She resumed cutting vegetables as she continued. Some of my fellow prisoners thought we were celebrating Chinese New Year itself. When Robert explained that the holiday had passed, that he had chosen to share this meal simply because he believed we deserved kindness, something broke inside me. Not something bad, but something that needed to break. The walls I had built around my heart, the propaganda I had believed, the fear that made me see enemies instead of people. The camera followed her hands as she coated pork cubes in cornstarch, the same technique Robert had taught her 25 years earlier. Food became my bridge to understanding America, not through language or politics, but through the universal experience of someone caring enough to cook for you. Robert's grandmother sent ingredients from this very kitchen to a prison camp in Pennsylvania because her grandson told her that enemy prisoners were still human beings who deserved dignity. That act of faith in humanity gave me the courage to choose life over death, hope over despair, America over Germany. Elfriede looked directly at the camera, her expression serious but peaceful. "People ask if I miss Germany. I miss the Germany of my childhood, before I knew what it truly was. But I cannot miss a place that committed such horrors, even if I was ignorant of them at the time. Here in America, I found something better, a chance to build a life based on the values I thought I was defending when I joined the Auxiliary Corps: freedom, dignity, opportunity, and the radical idea that former enemies can become family." Robert entered the kitchen, now 48 years old, his hair graying at the temples. He moved beside his wife with the comfortable familiarity of 23 years of marriage. Together they finished preparing the sweet and sour pork, their hands working in synchronized efficiency learned through decades of partnership. "My grandmother always said that when you cook for someone, you are saying, 'I see your humanity,'" Robert told the camera. "That night in 1945, I saw frightened young women far from home, and I wanted them to know that America could mean something better than war and hatred."